Part 3 of our journey through 1990 gives us an assortment of mid-tier titles, with only a few real standouts. A legitimately excellent game here is the smaller sibling to one of the NES's best platformers, DuckTales. We see the first game in the Bomberman series on the system, as well as the first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles one. Unfortunately, we also have to suffer through nonsense like Sakigake and Dragon Slayer. Not a good bracket for Japanese exclusives, sadly. Released around the world on consoles from the NES to the PlayStation, on home computers from the Sharp X68000 to the FM Towns, Puzznic is a 1989 arcade tile-matching puzzle game. Strangely, the Game Boy release never escaped Japan. Quite often this would be because of the lack of a market, but surely this wasn't the case with Puzznic as, like I say, it was otherwise pretty widespread. The aim of the game is to slide blocks about an enclosed grid, making matched sets. If 2, 3 or more blocks of the same design come into contact with each other, they disappear. You can move blocks left or right, regardless of whether they have anything on top of them, and they will descend gravitationally to the lowest available point. Now, of course, the blocks are not solely in pairs. There are frequently those in odd amounts, meaning you need to figure out how to get 3 of them to touch without losing them by touching 2. You can line them up in a row or make an L shape. When blocks are removed, ones on top will descend, allowing for chains to be made for higher points. It's a pretty weighty game. While not featuring quite the number of levels as some versions, there are 128 in total on the Game Boy, and even the early ones can take a few tries to get right. Thankfully, there are no lives to lose. Simply press start to reset the board and have another go. An attempt to overcome the lack of colour was made with the symbols that accompany a normal Puzznic game. But if this proves too hard to see, pressing select while in play emblazons a number on the blocks instead. This is functional, if a little soulless. This isn't a unique concept really. Block puzzle games were 10 a penny by the early 90s. Maybe that's why Puzznic never made it to the West. The market was already pretty saturated, what with Flipple, Tetris, Dr. Mario and so on. However, it uses the formula in a satisfying and quite addictive way, and password saves after each level means you can easily pick this up to fill a spare 10 minutes. No language barrier to overcome means it's worth an import, although I wouldn't say it's the cheapest title by any means. And it doesn't have the salacious eroge content that the arcade port had. But then, would you really want to look at nudes on a Game Boy? It's getting a little desperate. Internet memes are always fun, until they get stale, which is around a week or so, and the "how do I shot web" one has rarely been more appropriate. I consider myself reasonably good at video games. I'm no expert, but, well, when you own well over 2,000 retro games, including more than 1,000 Game Boy ones, you do learn a handful of skills that should theoretically be transferable between platforms and genres. But damn me, I can't figure out the controls in The Amazing Spider-Man. I think I figured out how to shot web. Pressing A to jump and then pressing A again in mid-air allows you to swing on the webs, but it doesn't always work. I think you need to be close to the top of the screen. In the comics, Spider-Man can shoot seemingly indefinitely long ropes, but here it appears the extra couple of feet makes all the difference. Sometimes it happens when you don't mean for it to. There's a part on the first level where Spider-Man becomes bamboozled by 2 crates stacked on top of one another. You can jump at that thing all you want, but he won't get past it. You need to sort of walk backwards and jump at an angle to encourage the guy to shoot his ropes up somehow. It takes ages. You apparently can fire a mess of webbing at enemies, but I can't get this to work at all. You can't run and attack at the same time, apart from this hard-to-use jump kick, meaning level progression is very much a stop-start affair. There's a straight punch and a crouching kick thing, but honestly, for a lot of the horizontal stages, you're better off jumping over as many enemies as you can, because you'll just take too much damage otherwise. Occasionally, you'll come across a vertical wall climbing stage where people pop out of windows and swing baseball bats at you, and medicine balls drop out of the sky to knock you off. Well, they don't actually knock you off. Spider-Man clings on as long as he has some health left. Don't press anything on this stage though, because this will cause Peter Parker to let go of the wall and fall to his death. It baffles me why somebody would go to the trouble of programming in a suicide button. You're supposed to jump for a window right at the very end, but it's still stupid, and could have been used for some sort of blocking mechanism. Also, the attack button on this stage doesn't really work properly, so don't bother trying. A nice looking game that sounds pretty decent as well, and has some nice storyline and intermission cutscenes for each stage. However, the audio-visual presentation of a game was rarely LJN's downfall. The reason that games involving these guys so often have that notoriety for being bad is because the control systems don't work how they're supposed to. You can look in the manual if you like, but it doesn't help. The devs couldn't even explain how to play their own game, and sadly it renders the Amazing Spider-Man about as entertaining as a Spider-Man thread on 4chan. Read all about it. The 80s arcade classic, which was ported to virtually every system at the time, found its way onto the Game Boy. You are the eponymous Paperboy, and with a constant forward motion along an isometric plane, are tasked with delivering papers to your subscribers by hurling them at their houses. You gain points for scoring a paper in their mailbox, but lose points if you smash their windows. Apparently, these papers are wrapped around bricks. Along the way, you have plenty of obstacles to avoid, such as mangy dogs, crazed motorists, runaway lawnmowers, and death. Over the course of a week, your aim is to convince the whole street to subscribe to you, while retaining current people by not missing them out. The NES version is vaunted for being an entertaining and wholly playable version of the arcade version. It sold really well, and can probably be considered a classic game on the system. However, the same is not true of the Game Boy version. This one is a direct port of the NES version, which brings with it a multitude of problems. When I say direct, this is literally a scaled down monochrome version of the same code from the NES game, which never really works. In fairness, a monochrome rendition of Paperboy was always going to be tough. Your subscribers' houses are different colours, so not having this at your disposal immediately makes your deliveries hard. Imagine how a postman would feel faced with a street taking all the numbers from their doors, and you've got it. Sure, subscribers are shaded slightly differently, but seeing as how you lose a lot of the visuals anyway due to the heavily cropped screen, you'll need to be a wizard to identify correct houses on the fly. With such a close perspective to your character, it's harder than it should be to avoid obstacles. Zooming out a little rather than cutting out so much of the play area would have been the logical solution. You barely get any reaction time, especially if you're on the road. Due to the random nature of the game, it's not even something you can learn. If you're in the road and a car appears, there's no way you're dodging it. In fact, I feel as though you still wouldn't have space to move even with the fastest reflexes. If you see it, you're hitting it. The Game Boy version of Paperboy stands as a great example of a recurring problem on the system. Sticking too closely to a home console blueprint and trying to shoehorn it into the little handheld was so often a surefire way of cocking up a classic franchise. According to the cover art, the Way of Stones has something to do with Stonehenge. However, Oshido is clearly Japanese. It does sort of translate as the Way of Stones, but there's nothing ancient about this game. The whole background about the different cultures was just invented to create a mysticism surrounding the game. It certainly feels more akin to Mahjong or something than anything the Druidic Britons would have played. Anyway, don't worry about the spiel behind the game, it's not important. Whatever the title means, it sounds cool. However, it doesn't really give us a clue what the game's about, so if you were wondering, Oshido the Way of Stones is a board game. You have a 12 by 8 board, so 96 squares, upon which to place 72 stones. There are an assortment of stones, each being one of 6 shades and 6 designs, making 36 pairs. The aim is to place a randomly drawn stone on the board somewhere, next to one of the same shade or design. At the start of the game, there will be some stones already placed to start you off. The outermost space on each side of the play area is a darker shade, and placing a stone on here, while a legitimate move that follows the same rules, will give no points. You need to place your pieces in the lighter middle part. If you match a tile by shade or design on one side, you're awarded 1 point. You can match on multiple sides for more points. 2 sides gives 2 points, 3 sides gives 4, and 4 sides gives 8, as well as a ton of endgame bonuses. However, to make these multiple moves, you can't just line up stones of all the same colour or design, you have to mix and match. So for instance, to connect 2 sides, one of the adjacent tiles must match by design and the other by shade. For 3 sides, you need 2 of one and 1 of the other, and to match 4 sides at once, which is very hard, especially in 2-player mode, you need 2 matching shades and 2 matching designs. That's why you get so many points for it, and with the bonuses that increase exponentially the more you get, getting one in a head-to-head basically renders the contest moot. The 2-player mode is pretty good fun and can be done via link cable or turn-based. Playing against the CPU is a nice challenge. It's hard but quite winnable, unlike some board games on the Game Boy, and there's little computation time, the AI just gets on with it. The game's designed to be a solitaire game, certainly in the Mahjong family if not directly related to it. Single player has just as much longevity as 2 players, where the 4 side bonuses can really rack up, and because strategy will come into play much more here, they're more achievable as well. Musically, it's very pleasant, but obviously this isn't a genre you need a soundtrack for. It's perfectly alright to play on silent, and if you're playing a game like this, you're probably on a train or something anyway. Graphically, everything is clear and you get a choice of tile sets to use. There's not much else to tell you. If you like solitaire games, you can't go wrong with Oshido. Many people remember Fall of the Foot Clan, and if they've not played it since childhood, they probably get warm fuzzies just by reading the title. I certainly did when it came to reviewing this. This just goes to show how obscuring nostalgia can be. Replaying this game gave a very different account than the one I would have written from memory alone. Something I didn't appreciate when I was 7 was just how good this game sounds. Featuring music by the astounding Michiru Yamane, later of Castlevania fame, Fall of the Foot Clan is an absolute joy to listen to. Pulsating music with the familiar cartoon motif is replaced in equal parts by driving high-tempo boss battles with progressive bass lines that wouldn't be out of place in Belmont's Revenge, and eerie, atmospheric tracks accompanying your trips into the sewers. Get this game for the music alone, because it's honestly one of the greatest on the whole system. The accompanying sound effects let it down a little though. They're sparsely used and only sound okay. The scenery is very well drawn too, with some nice background animations that Konami was very well versed in. There's very little flicker or slowdown at any point. It's a shame that the backgrounds are repeated so frequently. The nicest looking worlds get dull if you have to pass the same buildings or scaffolds time and time again. The sprites are detailed enough, and of a decent size, but again, there aren't many different ones, and there's little discernible difference between the 4 playable characters. The characters don't play any differently either, which is something even the first NES title managed. The game deserves a reasonable amount of credit for these 2 things, but sadly there's nothing else about it that warrants compliment. You walk very slowly from left to right, while flailing your weapon at the same enemy, called foot soldiers in the manual. You'll see millions of them, over and over again. They attack in the same pattern, 3 from the right and then 1 from behind, for example. Some hold pizza above their head for some reason. This can go on for 5 minutes with no variation in enemy, pattern or scenery. Just when you think the level must be looping, you'll find a boss. These look good, but are pretty tedious to fight. They only have 1 pattern. The game goes on and on like this. It's a good job the music is so great because there'd be no reason to carry on otherwise. If you manage to get to the last boss, it's an absolute joke. Just stand to the far left and it never hits you. Did nobody bring these points up at QC? Or did none of the testers bother to get that far? Between levels there is a bonus level which, somehow, manages to be even more boring than the main game. You need to collect these pizzas that appear for a short time, which replenish your health after the level. Having only 4 characters with 1 life each, you sadly need to do this, as they don't heal up after each stage. Throw in the cardinal sin of unavoidable damage, and you have yourself a really unappealing title here. If this wasn't a Ninja Turtles game, it probably would have been forgotten. It certainly wouldn't have sold nearly as well. Solid graphics and excellent music aside, don't let the decent score fool you too much. There's nothing radical about this one. Based on the anime of the same name, Sakigake Otokojuku is a 1v1 fighting game where you play as the sword-wielding sociopath Momotaro. The source material is not known in the same realms of your Yanma 1/2 or your Gundam, and never saw a release anywhere other than Japan. It's heavily based on Japanese history and culture, including straying into the dicey worlds of nationalism and passive racism, and would in no way successfully translate to an English-speaking audience. There's no way to instill humour into it as you'd find in your Dragon Ball Z or Pokemon, for example. I kind of understand the plethora of puzzle games on Game Boy so far. They're relatively easy to program and don't require massive graphical or gameplay stretches to figure out. Fighting games, however, surely require more finesse and nuance in the control scheme than could be offered by the 2-button format, especially if you don't use the 2 buttons properly. Sure, there are your Mortal Kombats and Street Fighter 2s of this world, but for every successful one, there seems to be 4 or 5 god-awful or simply subpar attempts. Let's be honest, it wasn't until the dawn of the 2 aforementioned fighting game royalty that there were really any fighting games worth playing, certainly not retrospectively through today's eyes. All that said, if you can believe it, the standard of this game is low even by 1990 standards. You have 1 attack used by pressing B and jump using A. That is the entirety of the control scheme. No way to block, no variation in the skills, or really anything at all. It was already an established motif that you press up to jump in these sorts of games, thus freeing up the other face button to, do stuff. The graphics are somehow less detailed than Fist of the North Star, which is some kind of accomplishment. It's a task to differentiate between the characters, and the background is the most sterile-looking mountain range of triangles that never changes. It's probably not possible to have more cliched music than what's on offer here. The AI are idiotic and prove no challenge at all, fruitlessly jumping into the air without really ever attacking you. No challenge, that is, until you meet the boss. The cheapness of his movements, not even smooth by the way, he just seems to phase in and out of reality while also jumping off screen half the time. It's almost insulting, you'll never hit the guy. Let's have a little info session about the publishers of this car crash, shall we? This may be the first you've heard of Yutaka, but you know their work. Remember Master Karateka? That dumpster fire was published by an offshoot of Bandai called Bandai Shinsei. That little sub-company was essentially renamed Yutaka, strangely meaning a bountiful harvest, and served as a way for Bandai to release crappy toys and shovelware video games without having to sully their good name by putting their logo on them. This probably worked too, seeing as how there would continue to be much dross released on Game Boy and beyond, with Yutaka emblazoned on the front. You thought your dirty little secret was safe, didn't you, Bandai? But it's the 21st century now, and we've got Wikipedia. Penguins again, but this one is totally different. It has a beret on and is apparently an electrician. Still with me? Okay, this is another one of those Pac-Man adaptations where you navigate a maze made of electric cables and have to destroy all the dots, or nodes, before the enemies catch you. This goes right down to the enemies. They look exactly like the ghosts in Pac-Man, with not even an effort to say otherwise. The maze itself is like a grid, or a circuit I suppose, and you need to close all of the loops by destroying the nodes along the way. If an enemy is on a particular loop when all the power is turned off, they'll temporarily die. Pressing A next to one of the black dots causes it to go flying off, which can be used to knock enemies out. This is useful later on as you can kind of snipe at enemies from across the screen. Instead of power pellets, you have these lighter dots that look like electrons in a school kid's textbook. Little circles with a minus sign in them. These make the enemies change direction, not away from you, just opposite. Graphically it's simple, but simple works on the Game Boy, and it definitely does a better job than the port of Pac-Man did. While not all levels are based on just a single screen, everything is clear. The music is very professionally composed and suits the nature of the game. Using headphones you can hear how bassy the tracks are. It's always nice to get more of a broad spread out of the sound chip. If I had one complaint, it would be how precise you need to be to turn corners sometimes. You almost have to press the direction slightly before you move. It's not intuitive, but you get used to it. Amazing Penguin is nothing new really, but a well-made, at times frantic little action game. Please, no more penguins though, there are other animals, you know. Hide and seek has turned deadly, and it ain't no kids game anymore. The name of the game is Pound or Be Pounded. My innuendo alarm is blaring in my head right now, but this isn't anything rude. In fact, the premise of Bionic Battler is kind of dark. The robots of Earth have rebelled, Asimov's laws pounded into dust, and you've been imprisoned in their quote-unquote labyrinths of war. Metallic mazes of mayhem designed for robots and guys in mech suits to have a massive tear-up. It's basically some futuristic gladiator arena where you're the sport. You choose one of two mech suits. It doesn't really matter which as they play identically. You're then asked to pick option on or off. option for what, I don't know. It doesn't seem to change anything. Anyway, you take control of your suit from a 3D first-person perspective. The screen is separated into several different visuals and gauges. Top left is a radar. This tells you how close you are to another robot. If it starts filling up, then there's probably one within a couple of tiles. Top right is your energy, which governs your attacks. It decreases but slowly, and you can kind of take it to be a time limit in a way. If it depletes, then you're dead. It's replenishable only by finding an E-tank. There's maybe one of these per level that I've ever found. The majority of the top half is your first-person view. Keep an eye on this regularly, although you don't really use it to navigate. The bottom half of the screen is largely taken up with the overhead map. It's this that is most useful. It helps you work out safe places, and enemies show up on it too. Either side of the map are gauges representing your and your enemy's health and missile charge. Hold B to charge a missile. When it's fully powered up, you can fire it 3 spaces, but it takes a long time to charge. Don't try to fire missiles if you're face to face with an enemy, as they'll beat you to death before you manage to fire. Instead, punch with A. Each maze has a certain number of enemies to destroy, and the difficulty curve is basically a numbers game. The higher you progress, the more targets you have to take down. After the first battle's over, you get out of your mech suit and watch as your little chap, who looks a little like the character from Blaster Master, walks into some old guy's office, shakes hands with him, and then seems to merge with him. Freaky stuff. You get paid $1, just the one, and flick the peace sign until you're ready to progress to the next stage. The prize goes up depending on which stage of the 5 you tackle, but so does the number of enemy robots. 3 on the first, up to 7 on the 5th. Being reasonably conservative is the order of the day in Bionic Battler. A good strategy is to find a nice corner somewhere to camp out in, charge the missile to the max with B, and then fire as soon as an enemy is within 3 spaces ahead of you. They'll either back off, in which case you just charge up again and wait for them to return, or they'll be stunned, which is when you move in closer and pummel them till they explode. Your health doesn't replenish unless you find one of the rare batteries, so be resourceful and use the safer places to your advantage. If you go tearing around the maze looking for enemies, they'll no doubt destroy you eventually. Remember, there's several of them, but only one of you. You only have 1 life to beat all 5 stages too. The sound effects are great for a game that was released this early in the Game Boy's youth, as is the music, although possibly more of a darker theme would have suited the game a little better. The tunes are kind of jazzy and feel like they're from a cartoonish platform or puzzle game, but then, for a game where robots are blowing each other apart, it's pretty cutesy itself. An interesting title that's really unique and comes as a breath of fresh air at this point. The maze navigation works very well, visually it looks brilliant, and the space is used very economically. There's little depth or finesse in what you're doing, but for a half-an-hour session, Bionic Battler is a ton of fun. Yet another tile-based mahjong-y solitaire affair. Well, it's not mahjong at all, except the tiles bear a resemblance in a small way. Here, you have an arrangement of tiles in towers of various shapes, and it's up to you to eliminate tiles one by one, based on the order you're told to, without the tower collapsing. This happens if a block is no longer supported underneath by at least one other. It stands to reason you need to work from the top down as much as possible, only taking tiles from within the structure if there are no free alternatives higher up. It might be possible to pick ones from within a wide structure, Jenga style, as long as you're careful. Taking these that are more surrounded grants you more points, if that's important to you. You click a tile that matches the one at the top, and if removing it would collapse the tower, you'll be alerted. Clicking it again ends the game. You can select different game modes, some are timed, some allow you to choose various board shapes. There's no real progression as such, complete a level and you get a nice picture, but then it's back to the main menu. There's really little else to say about Hong Kong. A passable port of a Famicom game with debatable relevance and zero legacy. It's okay for a passing glance if you really can't find anything else amongst this 1,000-strong library, but it's certainly not making anyone's top 10 lists. What is quite impressive is the 3-letter seed that governs the board layout. Theoretically, this would give you 26 to the power 3 different possible layouts per board shape, and there are 10 shapes to choose from. In total, this gives you something like 175,000 different games to play. Whether they're all winnable, well, that's for the mathematicians to determine. Nihon Falcom are one of my personal favourite video game developers, more famous as they are these days for their wonderful Ys franchise of action RPGs. Many hours of my life have been spent in the company of Adol Christin on his ever more expansive adventures. Oft touted as one of the pioneers of this particular style of RPG, what we have here is a port of the 1984 PC-88 game of the same name, that started off the Dragon Slayer series. Many of these were Japanese exclusive, although Dragon Slayer 4 was released on the NES and was called Legacy of the Wizard, so there's a chance you'll have heard of it. The aim of the inaugural Dragon Slayer game, although you wouldn't know it, there aren't any story cutscenes in this version, is to collect these 4 crowns that are each guarded by a dragon. Along the way, you need to collect or upgrade your weapons to ward off ever stronger enemies. Sounding pretty standard so far? Incorrect. First off, the controls are the stiffest I think I've ever experienced. Your character moves as if in stop motion, pausing on every tile. And that's fine in a turn-based dungeon crawler, but Dragon Slayer is marketed as a real-time action RPG. The response when trying to move is ludicrously inaccurate, sometimes requiring 3 or 4 presses of the D-pad to move your knight where you want him to go. The button controls are equally maddening. You expect to be able to attack, but A is used to pick up whatever's on the ground, and B brings up an empty magic menu. No, you have to first find a weapon, but to do this, you need to navigate towards a warp point that is miles away. You have one utility slot that needs to be used for shields, jewels, and so on. Picking up a ring, for example, allows you to move blocks around. A cross can be used to block paths as enemies cannot cross them. Collecting a jewel in the maze and returning it to your home allows you to level up stats and such. Having to press A on every single coin you find in order to pick it up is another facet of the game that gets very old very quickly. If you manage to navigate this block-pushing maze, you can then accompany your tool with a sword, but only after traversing a void completely filled with aggressive skeletons and spiders. Don't come into contact with any of them, because you're unarmed at this point and will be devoured. And you can't easily run from battle either. It's possible, but not intuitive, and you'll lose health doing so. Plus, if you get cornered, you're basically finished. The fighting sequences seem to be calculated based on a dice roll, which is fine if there's only one enemy. More than that accosting you can lead to an unwinnable situation where you barely get to attack. Another thing I should mention about the enemies, kill one and another will respawn somewhere on the map, but it'll be of a higher level than the one you just slew. Seeing as how your leveling up doesn't come from killing the enemies, it's probably beneficial to just avoid them, which is a pretty lame way of being a hero. The accompanying music is a 20-second loop that is an absolute cacophony. It starts off as a decent enough RPG-sounding tune, which quickly blends into a complete mess of notes offensive to the ears, causing anyone with hearing to immediately mute the game. The worlds are empty and uninspiring, with all the sprites, from a single coin to the player to a whole house, being the exact same size. I know it was the 90s, but some form of realism could have been attempted, or at least make the sprites look half decent. A huge problem is the amount of grinding you'll have to do to get anywhere, and it's a slow grind, not just because of the ridiculous movement. Ever-diminishing experience returns and laborious backtracking ensures there'll never be a speedrun of this game. You can, peculiarly, push your home in the same way you can push a block, in order to move it nearer to a cache of jewels, but really it doesn't help that much. You can also run the risk of forgetting where you put it. It's not just the tedium that's the problem with this artificially inflated gameplay. Remember that the Game Boy is a portable console, powered by batteries, unlike the home computer it was originally on. And there's basically no way to complete the game on one set of batteries, even if you got the really good expensive ones. And this was 1990, way before the rechargeable power packs came out. Okay, fine. Final Fantasy or other RPGs around at the time were of a similar length, although much more compelling with it. But they had passwords or a save game mechanic, meaning you could turn the game off if you wanted a rest. Not here, oh no, you're playing this in real time. That's not immersion, and it's not practical. So unless you're playing this on emulator or a Super Game Boy, don't ever expect to see the ending. If you've just finished Link's Awakening and are looking for something in a similar vein, I implore you to please keep on looking. This ain't it. Thrilling war simulation game. Not my words, but the blurb on the rear of the box. Power Mission is a title with one of the paltriest reservoirs of information that I've come across up to this point. I'm not saying I've googled this entire book, but I always try to have some background information to hand before starting to review any game. But hey, I like a good strategy game, and it's not exactly a popular genre on the Game Boy, so I'll do my best. By any other name, Power Mission is a battleship game, let's be honest. The year is 1999, and the country of Jagoda has just attacked your homeland. That's not cool and can't be stood for. As the commanding officer of your nation's naval forces, you need to destroy the enemy fleet. You choose from 5 different fleets, each with its own configuration of battleships, submarines, aircraft, and so on. The first thing you notice is that the map is more terrain-based, with land and mountainous regions, as well as deep and shallow waters. Obviously, your choice of fleet will depend on the level layout. If heavily land-based, you'll need to choose one with more aircraft. The maps are much larger than previous battleship games, being 25 by 25 tiles. In all, there are 11 enemy fleets to dispatch. Actually, the battleship comparison isn't entirely accurate or fair, as Power Mission plays more akin to a game of chess, in that your different pieces are not static, but you need to move them. They all have different movesets and attack ranges, all that good stuff that isn't immediately obvious but you need to learn. Of course, fog of war is still a thing, in that the enemy's placement needs to be deciphered through the use of radars or blind luck. Tactics are obviously important, as in all strategy games, but unless you've played the levels before, it's not possible to know what you're fighting. Tentative Exploration is the name of the game, as reconnaissance clearly wasn't that high on your Navy's priority list. You'll need to discover things during the course of action and plan your moves accordingly. Weather effects such as strong winds come into play on the battlefield too, which is an interesting little addition. It's strange that by the end of 1990, we already had 3 games in this naval warfare vein. Battleship was first, with Radar Mission coming slightly later on this year. This one doesn't look or sound as good as the other 2, sadly. However, the gameplay is more varied than what we've seen before. Ambitious, but not as accomplished. Still, strategy fans will probably have a blast with Power Mission. Congratulations, you've just read probably the longest review of this game ever written. All those kittens, instant grams, and approximately 500 trillion hours of Minecraft Let's Plays, but sod all information on a decades-old Game Boy game of middling interest? Internet, you disappoint me. no, not Yutaka. Already thoroughly traumatized by Sakigake and Master Karateka, I don't know how much more of their drivel I can stomach. At least this isn't a fighting game. I must declare, however, I'm getting a little tired of games that are tie-ins to manga or anime. Invariably, they don't use the source material properly, are difficult to research, and typically are rushed nonsense that would barely qualify as games. Patlabor is at least a franchise that had a significant Western release, with fully translated manga, TV shows, and even a couple of movies. A portmanteau of the words patrol and labour, the show features mechs that are not only used for police work, but also everyday tasks. The Tokyo police force uses a fleet of these Patlabors instead of patrol cars to combat crime, and in fact the storyline arcs tend to revolve around this particular fleet, and the officers in command of them. The series' influence was widespread, with even Guillermo del Toro citing it as inspiration for his film Pacific Rim. As someone who is by no means a fan of this sort of thing, appreciating it from an artistic and storytelling standpoint, but not ever keen to fully invest a ton of time into it, even I am struck by how goddamn cool the Patlabor series of books and films seems to be. It's almost like a highbrow-ish Transformers, without any of the inherent childish cringe associated with that. Still, it goes without saying that few of these qualities were transposed onto the Game Boy game. Credit where it's due, the interstitials, while a little minimalistic, are drawn very nicely, lending at least a semblance of reference to the source material. The graphics are, at least in the fighting scenes, suitably put together, although the top-down impression of the city leaves a lot to be desired. You pilot your mech around a city accosting various enemy mechs, after which you enter a battle with them. There is, as anticipated, very little to do here. You really just select various commands until the other one dies, and then move on. There are a certain number of enemies per stage, and all stages are basically the same. Truth be told, I'm struggling to find a lot of pertinent information to even share with you, dear reader. Completely devoid as it is of any depth, I would recommend you skip this game and explore the anime. The films are definitely enjoyable even for a non-manga fan. It's always fun to find a game called 3 different things in different regions, and trying to work out whether you already own something or not. Atomic Punk is what this game was known as in North America, but in Europe we called it Dynablaster. You might have guessed at my mild annoyance that I bought both, not realising they were the same game. Thankfully, I'm not quite as obsessive over Japanese titles, as there it was called Bomber Boy. All 3 titles aside, however, this is actually the first Game Boy game related to the renowned Bomberman franchise. Why the title changes, I've no idea. Bomber Boy makes the most sense out of the 3, because here you're actually playing as Bomberman's son. I didn't know he had a bomber lady in his life, but there you go. Each stage features a grid with various enemies toddling about in it. These usually have set movement patterns. The goal is to plant bombs in such a way that these enemies get caught in the blast radius and are killed until they're all gone. This is basically a typical Bomberman game, but one with a bit of a twist. There's a kind of RPG element added to the game, not in the same way that Bomberman Quest would later give us on the Game Boy Color, but one where you have the opportunity to go to the panel shop in between stages. When you enter a particular stage, you can take with you up to 10 of these panels that provide extra aids to beating the layout. More panels are unlocked as you complete stages, and these are all level specific, meaning that the order in which you bomb through the levels has a bearing on how you can play. The levels are largely laid out in a gridiron fashion, with certain paths being blocked off by obstacles. You can usually destroy these with bombs and get more points at the end of a stage if you do so. Once all the enemies are dead, you actually need to find the exit, which is hidden under one of these obstructions, so it's always worth laying a bomb as you're walking past them. Be aware that it's not just the enemies that are vulnerable to your bombs, you can end up killing yourself too. The bombs explode a specific distance away from the blast point, in the 4 cardinal directions, unless there's a block in the way. Starting the main game gives you a decent initial idea as to what's going on. You have 7 stages with various amounts of sub-stages within it, until you can go on to the final stage. Move west from your home city to Hevel, the easiest level. This has 5 levels within it. You start off with 200 seconds and need to kill 2 enemies only. But as you move further through the rounds, the enemies get more populous and the time gets shorter. Beat this stage, however, and you unlock a speed up, which heightens your movement. Each city has a different reward, each of which has its own merits, so in a kind of Mega Man fashion you can get to know what you win from each place and plan your preferred route. Certain levels have their own quirks about them. There are cities in which the wind keeps changing, pushing you around. Some places have stronger blocks that take more than one blast. There are caves in one place that teleport you around. The final level has insta-death flames. Atomic Punk is an interesting take on the Bomberman franchise so far, I'm sure you'll agree. The panels are another addition that make this game rather special. These are collectibles that drop as you play. Some are unlocked from the start of the game and can be purchased from the shop straight away. Others have to be unlocked as you beat stages. These can revive you during a level, allow more bombs to be placed or give a larger blast radius, allow you to move quicker, or allow remote detonation of bombs. Some, like the Revive, disappear after use, but others, like the stat upgrades, are just things that you can place in your inventory once you've unlocked them, and, as long as you're carrying them, will always apply. There are several others as well, but I'll leave them for you to discover. As if that wasn't enough game for your money, there's also a Game B, which is basically a Game Boy port of the classic NES version. It's pretty faithful too. I never play it because the main game is so interesting, but it's there. There's a multiplayer game as well, but you need 2 copies of the game and a link cable. So, as is so often the case on my solo journey through the Game Boy library, I've never tried it. The appeal is with the main game. A refreshing take on a classic series. Well versed as I am with the noble art of table tennis, I confess to never having played a video game based on the sports club pastime. Possibly because there are scant few in existence, or possibly because casually I avoid sports games like the plague. Throw the ball in the air to serve with A and hit B to connect with the ball at the right time. You don't need to follow the ping pong rules where you serve across the diagonal, just hitting your side then the opponent's side is enough. All other functionality is operated by B plus a direction. B and left or right will angle your shot slightly that way, not by much admittedly, and holding down with B will play a conservative lob shot, good if the game is getting a little too quick and you just want to make a safe return. Up will do a kind of spin shot, where the ball will dramatically alter its trajectory after it hits the table once. As the AI gets progressively more difficult, these shots become more frequent against you, and the trick is, if you're up against one, do not attempt to play one back. It almost never works, with the ball going straight into the net. You don't need to move your bat, it'll automatically move for you, but if the ball is not in close proximity, you can switch between forehand and backhand by using the directional buttons. You can play in a tournament or in a versus mode against 8 competitors from different countries. Each game is first to 11 points, and the match is best of 3 games. Tournament mode takes you through countries in order from Poland to China. Beating the lot of them lets you play against the Grand Champion, a panda, in a surprise twist that definitely no one saw coming. After each victory, you get a 4-digit password, so don't feel like you have to plough through them all in one sitting. Entering 1199 on the password screen gives you access to a rudimentary stopwatch, the reason for which I have no idea, but it's there. The graphics are pretty effective, you're just a bat yourself, but the opponents are varied in design with praiseworthy animation throughout. Everything is very clear, including a kind of motion blur trail following your ball. This helps to not only pinpoint the ball, but also its direction and speed, a simple design choice that goes a long way to improving the experience. The hit detection matches up with what's on screen, so you can't blame your losses on cheap game design. Commendable is the gameplay, sure, it's simple but totally functional, and that was definitely not always the case with sports games. Perhaps the fact you don't actually have to move your bat might seem strange, and I wonder how much this choice was influenced by the desire instead to have more control over your shot selection. The controls are straightforward, but allow you to develop plenty of skill, and the difficulty curve in tournament mode is absolutely perfect. The AI have different levels of aggression too. The character representing China basically smashes every shot, which if you've ever seen them at the Olympics you know how accurate that is, meaning you're going to have to be super defensive and hold your nerve until an opening appears. If you want to beat the bear at the end, you're going to have to be very good indeed. Oh, do I have to? I'm getting pretty sick of this sport. I'm trying so hard to keep my personal opinions from killing the objectivity of my reviews, but I don't like baseball. As it happens, Extra Bases is a ton of fun. You choose one of 14 teams represented by a single letter. I don't know if they're related to MLB in any way, I guess not, but each one has unique rosters. Batters have their own averages and HR, and pitchers have unique ERA. Granted, I have no clue what any of that means, but it's an impressive level of depth. Anyway, based on what I do know about the sport, it's a playable rendition of the game. The animations are great, the movements are quick and responsive, it's actually possible to move your fielders to catch the ball. Seems like something that should be a given, to actually be able to do the things that baseball players do, but as we've seen before, it's not always the case. When you have the ball in hand, press A along with right, up or left to throw the ball to the respective base. Pressing B in a direction makes the infield player run to the base. You can play over 5 or 9 innings, and in a stadium or the park. It's an aesthetic choice, but it's nice to have. You pick your team, and the aim is to stomp through all other 13. You get a password save after each successful victory, so don't worry that you have to play the entire season in one go. The music is decent, and the sound effects don't sound horrendous, like in the launch title Baseball. In fact, the sounds are quite helpful when you're fielding, as it can be tricky to know exactly how high the ball is. You can measure the position your fielders need to be in by the pitch of the whistling. If you're not quite in place to catch a ball, you can press B in a direction to make your fielder dive for it. B and up causes the fielder to jump in the air to attempt to catch. This one totally took me by surprise. It's a Game Boy sports game that's actually excellent. Sometimes it's good to be wrong, to have your preconceptions challenged. That's how we grow, right? As a huge professional wrestling fan in the mid to late 90s, I remember being consistently disappointed at the lack of a quality video game devoted to the steroid-infused stunt show. It should go without saying that, as far as I can recall, every single one of the Game Boy ones suck even more than the norm of the time. With so many moves, it's hard to program such a thing with just a D-pad and 2 buttons. The first one I remember even being playable was the SmackDown titles on the PS1, or their cousins on the N64. But committed as I am to review all these games, sometimes you have to play a few Al Snows to really appreciate the Stone Cold Steve Austins. You can choose from 8 varied wrestlers, from Japanese and Mexican luchador types to masked beasts, one of whom really resembles Big Van Vader, and a guy called Joker who is a dead ringer for later 90s Sting. This foresight might be interpreted as highlighting the generic nature of wrestling memes back then. The character select screen promises a nice variation in the combatants available. Sadly, in the ring, it can sometimes be hard to differentiate. I found myself resorting to picking the big fat guy so that at least I could tell which wrestler I was controlling. Each character does have their own moveset, but for the most part it doesn't really matter. HAL Wrestling is one big button masher from bell to bell. The A button pins a downed opponent. If that happens to be you, mash B to get up. You can climb turnbuckles and leave the ring, but running is not possible. You can Irish whip the other guy, but your own character walks everywhere. There are a grand total of 2 match stipulations, which is more than you often got back then. You can fight a one-on-one singles match, both 1 or 2 players with the link cable, or a 4-on-4 elimination match. Countouts are a thing, but it's not the traditional 10 count that stands in every Western promotion that I've ever watched. Wrestlers get a count of 20 on the outside before getting counted out, as is more common in Japanese companies. You get a 5 count on the turnbuckles as well. There are a couple of methods to win, which is pretty ambitious. It's possible to win by submission as well as pinfall. All matches are best of 3 falls, which is unusual in itself, and have a 10-minute time limit. The controls are where this game struggles, but that's almost always the case with 8-bit wrestling games. Think how many there are on the NES, and without exception they're all kind of limited by the controls. Here there are certain combinations of buttons to press, but largely you need to be grappling to initiate them, and it's hit and miss whether a grapple will be successful. Most of the time it feels like you're just mashing A and B. Also, it took me a good while to realise that the start button is used to pull off some of the moves, especially some of the mat-based submissions. The presentation isn't the best, with some pretty daft music and no fighting sounds. I can see what the intention was, but the execution proved too complex due to the limited nature of the button mappings. It's got an element of fun though. The characters' bios are mad enough to be actual wrestlers. My personal favourite is the Canadian beardy freak called Death Monster, whose finishing move is simply taking a bite out of his opponent. This was 25 years before Broken Matt Hardy did it. See? Foresight. Yet another classic game from the mid-80s that found its way onto pretty much everything was First Star Software's Boulder Dash. While the Game Boy version was not directly programmed by those guys, in fact the original creator Peter Liepa was not mentioned anywhere in game or manual, a pretty bum move, but hey. It's a pretty accurate and thoroughly enjoyable version of a great puzzle game. The idea is that you're this excavator guy called Rockford who's on the hunt for massive shiny human-sized diamonds. You have to dig out caves and underneath boulders and other obstacles in order to get to these prizes. Each level has a predetermined amount to collect, after which you need to make it to the safe zone before the timer runs out. There are enemies in some levels, but the biggest danger to you are these boulders that you yourself cause to fall. The guy is not a smart treasure hunter by any means, as he's clearly never heard of a tunnel brace. Quite often lots of boulders can cascade down just by removing a small area of dirt, so you need to be careful and look around before making moves. Later on there are some pretty tricky levels where you need to carve your way through to a cavern containing diamonds, but in doing so you release an enemy that chases you. It's necessary here to block their path with a boulder or diamond by undercutting it and letting it fall behind you. Sometimes you may also notice that there are no diamonds immediately visible. What you usually have to do here is manipulate the boulders to drop onto some enemy somewhere. These will then die, leaving behind gems for you to collect. There are plenty of ways to do this, and you never need to collect all the gems of a level, so you can beat this game really any way you want to. There are 4 different worlds to choose from, each of which have different themes, enemies, and dangers. Some of the graphical choices are weird. Sometimes instead of boulders you have these primitive looking huts that were built on top of diamonds, and when you undercut them they all plummet to the ground. Sometimes it's these jellyfish and amoebas that fall on you. The graphics themselves are actually really good, although because they're quite large you have the obvious disadvantage of not being able to see very far. This was dealt with excellently though, as by pressing select you can zoom out, which allows you to see more of the level, allowing you to plan out where you're heading. This is very necessary once all the jewels have been collected, as that escape tile can be anywhere and it's pretty easy to get yourself stuck in this game. In fact, the zoomed out view isn't just a map, you can actually play the game like that, which I found myself doing more often than not, as some of these stages are pretty big. This is the sort of thing that really works on the Game Boy, and any problems with the prohibitive screen size were well anticipated and sorted out. Boulder Dash is always a fun game, and the Game Boy version is a great representation of it. Very enjoyable indeed. Oh, those notes, those glorious opening notes. They still give me nostalgic chills. I dare you not to sing it. So many hours of my and millions of other people's childhoods were played out to DuckTales. I don't usually start reviews by talking about the music, but such as it is, the soundtrack to the NES version of this game is definitely my favourite on the whole system. I distinctly remember standing still on the moon level and letting that tune play until the timer ran out, and I'm delighted to report that the Game Boy version is just as good. Alright, there are fewer channels to play with, so often the music gets cut in favour of a sound effect, but use headphones and get Scrooge to stand still for a bit just to see how good the Game Boy can sound. Wonderful. The game is, of course, based off the TV series by the same name, and you control Scrooge McDuck over 5 vastly different landscapes in search of awesome wealth to add to his massive pile. Capitalism, man. The levels are basically the same as the NES, with slightly different layouts, and are done well. Sometimes you jump around or smash statues to get other treasures or food. You have 3 hearts on your health bar and can extend it to 4 by collecting a star. Ice cream replenishes 1 heart and cake fills the whole lot. Each level has non-linear elements with plenty of secrets, leaving plenty of room for replayability. The controls can't be faulted. A makes you jump, and holding B next to a boulder makes Scrooge use his cane as a golf club, propelling it off diagonally. This can be used to kill certain enemies too. Jumping and then holding B and down allows Scrooge to do his pogo jump, which gets you to higher places as well as damages anything you can land on, objects and enemies. You can also cross spikes and other dangers like this. Make sure you keep B held down though, else you'll get damaged. The animation is absolutely Disney. It's top notch. Graphically, it's right up there by this point. So much attention to detail was put into the movements of all the characters, right down to Scrooge's hat dropping down a frame after he himself crouches. One criticism I could potentially level at the game is it's maybe slightly too easy. There are 3 difficulty modes, but I don't notice a great difference. But then, DuckTales was clearly marketed for younger players as well, and there's nothing wrong with having a nice breeze-through kinda game once in a while. It's still a very entertaining title with plenty of variation right the way through it. The bosses are fun to fight, but there's no save or passwords, so you'll have to play through in one sitting. Hey, you're not going to want to put this down anyway. Become a NASA astronaut without having to lose any weight, go to pilot school, or ride that spinny thing that makes me puke all over myself. Essentially, in Lunar Lander, the mission is to drive to the moon, pick up some space rocks, then come home again. The game comes in several parts. You first pilot what looks like the Discovery space shuttle in a frankly bizarre launch sequence. There's the famous T- countdown sequence where a bunch of stuff happens and you wonder whether you're supposed to be doing something. Don't worry, you're not. Once the ship is airborne, you need to keep it on the correct course, up, so that you can break gravity's pull before running out of fuel. You need to press a cardinal direction when indicated, or else, I don't know, sky dust gets in the way, I guess, leaving your ship way slower than it should be. Placing it just so in that vast open sky is okay, but anywhere else, I'm no astrophysicist, but surely with 400,000 pounds of thrust behind it, going through a cloud or hitting a bird can't make that much difference. I almost put the game down at this point because it's so convoluted and unnecessary. This is one of those game mechanics that not only adds nothing, but it also actively takes away from your enjoyment. Anyway, once you get into space, you can relax a bit, as the stupid part is over. In each mission there are various phases corresponding to a particular landing site. This might be a crater, a bay, you get the picture. During the only part of the game resembling the arcade version of Lunar Lander, drop your landing module into the particular site, getting bonus points for choosing a more difficult spot, while also avoiding asteroids and crashing into the landscape. Take care as well not to set your craft down too quickly or it'll explode. You get a fuel limit to control the thrusters, but it's much more generous this time. Once successfully landed, you're finally into the main chunk of the game. It's a bit of a tedious affair, but essentially you're traipsing about the surface of the moon waiting for your alarm to start going off. The higher the pitch of this alarm, the closer you are to the space rocks you're looking for. When it's so high as to be almost inaudible, press A or B to dig in the ground. Find 5 pieces before your air runs out, while also avoiding the Wall-E looking aliens that are waltzing around the place. Then return to your lunar module. Repeat this process for each of the landing sites. Each mission has 8 phases and there are 4 missions. This adds up to a good 2 hours of the exact same thing, over and over again. Thankfully, you only have to do that ridiculous launch sequence once. If you manage to get through the whole thing, firstly, what are you doing with your life? But you get the message you have courageously challenged this severe mission and completed the whole course. You have made a great contribution to space development. This achievement will be recorded eternally in the history of mankind. All the human race will show gratitude to your great success. Nah, you'll just be made fun of on The Simpsons, and millions of people will profess that you didn't actually do it, instead having filmed the whole thing on a movie set in Hollywood. Data East of Shadowrun and Windjammers fame, as well as a veritable smorgasbord of arcade classics, were a reputable development company that you're sure to have heard of. Side Pocket goes to show that even the best studios have off days once in a while. It's a top-down pool game that is kind of frustrating to play. An early strange omission you'll notice is that there's no opponent. Pool, by definition, is a 2-player competition. You can play a friend using a link cable, but not on the same system. For a turn-based game, that's a real shame. There are a couple of single-player modes to choose from. 9-ball mode is the standard US-style 9-ball pool, i.e. not the one with 2 colours and a black like UK people probably know. This is the one with numbered balls. You have to get the balls in the pockets in order. Obviously, we come to the second problem here. In 9-ball pool, the balls are coloured. Well, it's kinda hard to do that on a black and white screen, like the famous Ted Lowe line, for those of you watching on a black and white TV, the pink ball is next to the green. So when you're aiming your shots, the balls are replaced by numbers. Figure out which ball you're aiming for, then press B to switch to see the balls properly. It's not ideal, but with the monochrome limitation it works, and doesn't hold you back that much. What does hold you back, however, is the third problem. The biggest issue with Side Pocket is the distinct lack of regard for any attention to physics. It feels like the balls are made of sponge or something. The energy isn't transferred on contact as you'd expect. Getting a decent break off is also impossible. I've been quite meticulous here and save stated a break, changing the parameters ever so slightly, and every break I've done sucks. The balls just don't react how you'd imagine. The game also suffers from a real lack of accuracy. It doesn't need to be flawless, it's never going to be an accurate simulation of pool, but this is ridiculous. You can put a load of time and effort lining the shot up, only for it to go nowhere near where it should. There's also a pocket mode, whereby you have a limited number of shots to clear the table. Once in a while, a star will appear in one of the pockets. Hit a ball in there, and you get more shots. The music is cool, but other than that, there's little redeeming quality here. Don't get Side Pocket, it's average at best. Get yourself a Game Boy Color and a copy of Pro Pool or 3D Pocket Pool. They both get everything right that this one gets wrong. You probably don't know Maru. I certainly wasn't aware of the character, or indeed the franchise. This was part of the Jaja Maru series of largely Japan-exclusive games, all that is except this one. You play as this very 90s looking kid with a baseball cap called Maru, and guess what? You gotta rescue Corey, your girlfriend. You move from left to right for the most part, through 6 worlds, while firing shurikens at people. Oh yeah, Maru's a ninja too, because, you know, 90s. Don't worry about the storylines. What's unusual about this game is there's no score, just a health bar. You start with 200 health, but it can go all the way up to 999. Killing an enemy releases their soul, which you can somehow absorb to gain a little health. When you get hit, your health is barely scratched, making this game criminally easy. Even the boss attacks don't really hurt you too bad. Although nigh invincible, your character is only a little dude, but he can jump incredibly high. Quite often he'll clear the top of the screen. A lot of enemies are avoidable this way, meaning you can cheap cut your way through much of the levels if you want. There's no ammo for your weapons, which is nice, and you can spam that button to rapidly throw many stars, killing most enemies instantly. This game's so easy that it's almost cruel. There's a plethora of other weapons to collect as well, including a weapon that replaces your shurikens with a load of meteors flying forwards, as well as one that casts down a vertical streak of lightning. Pretty epic stuff, commanding the elements like that. Makes you wonder how someone with such powers was dense enough to let his girlfriend get kidnapped. There's a wagon thing that makes you invincible for a while, and also one who summons Maru's mate, or brother, or whoever, who sort of turns up and does his thing, and then disappears. That's not nearly all of them, there are a lot of power-ups. At the midway point in each stage there's a mini-boss, all of whom are a doddle to beat. They'll give you a weapon that you need to murder each respective end boss. Really good of them to keep each major enemy's Achilles heel in the hands of a slightly weaker enemy. Great evil genius planning right there. So, the 6 worlds you play in are, in order, North America, Romania, Greece, Egypt, Brazil, and Japan. Greece and Egypt remain in the ancient worlds that they're famous for, and of course Dracula is still roaming about the Carpathians. Like I say, don't worry about the storylines. If you need to cross the ocean at all between countries, i.e. to get from North America to Romania or Egypt to Brazil, this is done by swimming. I mean, yeah, that's how I would do it. This takes the form of a shark harpooning minigame. They love that spearfishing thing in Japan, don't they? This is the most confusing part of the whole game. Why not take a plane, first of all? It's going to take Maru years to swim across the Atlantic, by which time Corey's probably going to have Stockholm syndromed all over the place and married her captor. What does Maru have against sharks, anyway? So he can fire throwing stars and command lightning at his overland enemies, but now, underwater, he has to use a trident? The whole minigame is stupid, the hit detection is terrible, and if you die, you actually do game over here. Just stop it. I have to say, Maru's mission does look pretty cool. The backgrounds are varied, and they manage to feature a lot of sprites on the screen without any considerable slowdown or flicker. The sound effects are superb, and the music is like a Double Dragon soundtrack with a comedic twist. Actually, that's not a bad way of describing the whole thing. As you progress through the game, there's some lovely variation. The third world, Greece, has this strange anti-gravity thing, like we saw later on with Wendy Every Which Way, or VVVVVV, where you can invert gravity and walk on the ceiling. Very cool. Also in World 4, Egypt, you'll come across Sphinx. You have to answer a riddle, and if you get it right, you can skip her battle. So look, Maru's mission is a walk in the park, and it's completely daft in places, but it's a lot of fun to blast through. There's nothing to take seriously in this game, although I do have to ask, what in the green hell is wrong with that cover art? Despite having no involvement with the production of the original game F1 Boy, Sunsoft continued their shaky start to Game Boy publishing when porting this 1990 Japanese release to Europe and renaming it Sunsoft Grand Prix. 1992 saw Formula One at its most popular, with legends Nigel Mansell, Riccardo Patrese, Alan Prost and Ayrton Senna battling in some of the greatest rivalries of all time, as well as a roster of amazing future talents such as Michael Schumacher and Damon Hill. So, why the hell not grab anything related to the sport and cash in, right? You're first greeted with a nice picture of your car, and adulating supermodel fans blowing kisses and applauding for who I can only assume is meant to be F1 Boy, even though she's clearly a girl. You can pick between F3000, the slowest, F1, and Super. Pick a custom-length season of a single race, 4, 8, or 16 races, followed by your choice of track and how many laps, all the usual stuff. Afterwards, you have a large list of engine and gearbox setups. The smaller engines are slower, but easier to control, and vice versa. You can also choose manual transmission if you like that sort of thing. These cars are even quicker. Just find one you like and stick with it. The tracks don't vary a massive amount from each other, so don't worry too much. You'll notice straight away some strange design choices. While according to the minimap you're going round a circuit, the game itself looks like a point-to-point affair with the cars moving predominantly up the screen. This is disorientating to say the least if you're trying to follow the map. You really don't feel as though you're moving around a connected track at all. It reminds me of those old Tomy racing toys you have as a kid with the stationary car and rotating background. While the music is your pretty standard but decent racing background, Sunsoft Grand Prix really lacks any sort of in-race sound effects. On a console so graphically limited, the illusion of speed is often best created with a gradient of engine roar. But here, even when you use the turbo boost, the cars are silent. Remember the recent uproar when Formula One introduced the greener, quieter engines? The Gammons of the world were mad because the cars didn't sound like racing cars anymore. Well, this is an extreme of that. Speaking of graphical limitations, this game copes pretty well. You're zoomed in quite close, and it's completely top-down, so there's no background to speak of, but what's there is alright. There's a fair bit of flicker when more than about 4 cars are on screen, due to the map overlay being drawn as sprites as well, but not much slowdown, and it doesn't hinder the gameplay. No qualifying means you always start at the back of the grid, and passing is made tough by a mixture of bad controls and immovable opponents. If you collide with another racer, you slow down, but they don't. Also, the AI never crash. You do. A lot. This is down to the controls being just stupid. Similar to how, despite the corners, the race always seems to be heading northward, your car always tries to default to the northward direction. So turning left doesn't permanently orient your car leftward. As soon as you let go of left, the car tries to revert back to a vertical position. Why the developers chose to do this, I can't fathom, but there it is. On top of this, holding a direction turns your car until it's horizontally facing that way. This sucks because a lot of track sections are at 45 degrees, meaning you have to balance between holding and releasing the direction just to go in a straight line, causing you to weave about like you've been at the post-race Cordon Rouge. The opponents don't have this problem, of course. There are plenty of racing games on the Game Boy, including several Formula 1 style ones. This one is kinda rubbish, and it's surely only down to the popularity of the sport that led Sunsoft Grand Prix to sell decently. It did alright, but is more of a Mark Blundell than a Nigel Mansell. Major bummer, dude. I'm about to tell you about one of the most brutal games you'll ever play. N Rad isn't like the first Skate or Die game on the NES, which was essentially a bunch of mini-games. It's a bit closer to the sequel, The Search for Double Trouble, but is by no means the same as that either. You're first on this 2D street level filled with pitfalls, spikes, dogs, and all the regular city platform tropes, and need to collect what look like beer cans and ice creams along the way. Enemies will throw knives and stuff at you, but you can avoid them to a certain extent by timing jumps just right so that they hit the underside of your board. Jump with A, crouch with B, and increase speed left and right in the way you'd expect. The top speed isn't much, and it doesn't increase any more by crouching. It's not Tony Hawk's level of physics by any standard, but the movement is reasonably intuitive. After the street level, you'll enter a demented child's bedroom where after not too long a time, you'll need to fight this jester character who throws fireballs at you. You can't touch the jester at all, but basically need to deflect these projectiles back at him by ollieing and hitting them with the underside of your board. It only works if you're jumping upwards. Landing on top of a fireball hurts you. You only need to hit the guy 4 times, but the movement is very tricky to get down, and you have a strict time limit to do it. Manage to beat the first boss, and you go to an overhead vertically scrolling race down a sewer drain. This is as tricky as you like. Instant death spikes, the river coming across the pathway, guys on overhead walkways with fishing hooks that capture you and take a bunch of your precious time limit. Wow, it's frustrating. Lives are really stingy as well in this game. If you manage to make it through that hellish level, you drop down into the sewers themselves, onto another side-scrolling stage. This is actually much more pleasant to play. The difficulty of these side stages are not nearly as brutal, and if you maintain a certain speed, you can fly through them in a way that's actually a lot of fun. Don't rest though, because level 4 is incredibly tough. Racing downwards again while this giant spiked tube thing rolls after you. It's instant death, of course, all the while trying to avoid the usual traps and pits. 5 is yet another downward level, but it's somehow even more brutal. You're travelling down this half-finished bridge with instant death on both sides, crumbling sections, tons of opportunities to fall to your death. Massive border-eating birds of prey and an attack helicopter. What did this guy do? Right at the end, there's a pixel-perfect part where you have to grind on a rope, and it is impossible. Well, obviously it's not, but I just don't know how any human player could be expected to nail this part in the handful of lives it takes to get there. And if you manage to get to stage 6, well, I'll let you discover that diagonal hall of a million deaths for yourself. The start of stage 7 is as far as I can get. I don't know what comes after that, my skills will only take me so far. The sound effects are excellent, as you might expect from a Konami title, but the music, while good, is not quite up to their high standards. It's competent and fits the theme well enough, and you won't be listening to it anyway, you've got enough to concentrate on. I love the graphics though, especially some of the boss animations and backgrounds. At first, playing what is fundamentally a skating game, I was a little disappointed that there are no kickflips or 360s to be had, but shortly you realise that you've got plenty to contend with. Lots of people hate this game, and it's easy to see why. While I think that hate is a little harsh, it is far too hard, and doesn't really test your reflexes so much as your ability to remember how the levels go. It's a test, not one of skill, but of rote learning. This game goes on and on, with ass-whooping after ass-whooping. Skate or die? Probably more of the latter, I'd say.
It was going so well.
My ears! Make it stop! If you ever wondered what a soundtrack composed by someone with no musical or programming knowledge would sound like, this is it. Someone should have pointed out that there are actually 4 usable channels for the sound on the Game Boy, not just one. What we get is a horrendous atonal pebble dash of unsmoothed and unprocessed square waves that could have come from a ColecoVision. In fact, no, that's not fair on the ColecoVision. This is one time when I'm glad the song doesn't continue into the game. Instead, there's a nasty attempt at a clack sound for the wheel, and a couple of bloopy noises for when the letters light up. In my research, I came across the TV theme used around this time in the USA, and you can kind of hear a similarity, but it's something of a stretch. It's very rare that I give a 0 score for any category, but when the game would actually be better if it was silent, how can I justify giving even a single point? Anyway, rant over. I'm almost certain everyone knows what Wheel of Fortune is. The game show that started in the USA that was equally popular in the UK, and I'm certain many other places. There is a hangman-style word puzzle on a massive board, and 3 contestants take turns to spin a points wheel. If the wheel lands on a number, the contestant then chooses a consonant that they think might be present in the puzzle. For every letter they unveil, they get that number in points. Vowels can be purchased, and the player who solves the board wins their points total. At the end of the game, the winner plays a single round where they get to choose 5 consonants and 1 vowel, and then get 10 seconds to guess a single puzzle, in order to win a grand prize. The Game Boy version is basically that, if a little simpler. You can play a single-player game, although that's pointless, or up to a maximum of 2 players. There's a large variety of conundrums. I've yet to see a repeated puzzle, so that's at least to the game's credit, although I have a slight problem with some of them. The categories of the puzzles are one of phrase, thing, or person, amongst others. Thing is incredibly vague, and it certainly doesn't help. The first thing I had to identify was embalming fluid. Person is equally misleading. Sometimes it can be a famous person, but other times it's something stupid. I've had a final puzzle where the person in question was Roman centurion. Phrase doesn't miss out either. I've had $1 million infield and whitewash the truth before now. I don't know about American English, but those aren't phrases I've ever used. Having said that though, there's something compelling about playing Wheel of Fortune. The AI is stupid, sure, they'll pick strange letters like X or Z on their first go sometimes, and you'll find yourself calling BS occasionally at the answers, but even so, I actually do like this. It looks unfinished and sounds unstarted, but like a parent looking at their really ugly child, I wistfully sigh and admit that there's still something to love. Ever wondered what it'd be like to be a fish? You have. If you want to play a video game that enables you to emulate your strange fantasy, then I give you Fish Dude. You're this average-sized fish who's just trying to get by in its average fishy life. You need to eat a certain number of smaller fish while trying to avoid getting eaten by the bigger ones. Not dissimilar to working in middle management. You can eat the little fish by pressing A. They don't seem to try to escape from you, and in a panic you can spit it out by pressing B. You have a time limit to consume all your prey because savouring food isn't really a luxury in the ocean, and you need to use B sometimes as it takes a while to eat the little fish, which leaves you really vulnerable. There are other enemies too. A fisherman, a bird, a ghost for some reason. It's the big fish you need to worry about though. Problem is, worrying about them is not going to save you. Bigger fish are usually that way for a reason. Clearly they're the successful predators, and as a result, this game is far too hard straight away. There's no difficulty curve. Fish Dude starts impossible and remains impossible. I've only seen other stages by using passwords, and not a single one of them can I beat. There's not really any viable strategy that works, you just have to hope. It wouldn't be so bad if there was some sort of defense mechanism you can employ, but no. There are a few hiding places that help for a short while, but you need to be wary of the time limit, and it's not like Metal Gear, where enemies will eventually lose interest. Oh no, as soon as you move, they're on you. Once you're caught, there's no respawning, you restart the stage. Basically, anything you can think of that the game could do to help you out doesn't exist here. The music is quite nice, pretty standard for the system at this time, and could have come from any puzzle game. I've only heard 3 songs in-game. The GBS file has a few more, but they're mostly similar. Graphically, it's pretty reasonable. Nothing flashy, but you can tell what everything is just fine. The problem is that the hitboxes aren't completely accurate. In fact, they're quite poorly programmed, so you can be swimming away, and try to nimbly duck around a coral or something, only to get stuck on it. Clearly, a fish's innate ability to avoid obstacles wasn't accounted for. Boring biology fact of the day, that's called lateral line mechanoreception, kids. Fish Dude is an interesting concept that was completely ruined by being one of the most unfair and frustrating games I've ever played. Plus, it's quite expensive. Definitely one only for silly completionists like myself. Hey, maybe Fish Dude wasn't intended to be beaten. Maybe it's a metaphor for life or something. That we all get eaten by predators in the end. That there's always a bigger fish. Being a medium-sized fish sucks.